The age-old 4x3 versus 16x9 battle is far from done. Every day, hundreds of Twitter trolls still fight for whether the true Chads use 16x9 or 4x3 stretched. Admittedly, both have very strong arguments, but that's not what's important today. See, we don't care who the true Chads are, we just want to have the biggest advantage possible. What's up, ProGuides fam? I'm Kangas, and today I'm bringing you our Global Elite Players Ultimate 16x9 versus 4x3 stretched guide. After watching, you should finally have a good idea of which one is right for you, as well as why. So hit that sub button, and let's get into it.
Alright, so the first thing that you should obviously consider with these things is which offers the better visibility, 16x9 or 4x3 stretched. But to be honest, that's kind of a difficult question to answer. Both have their ups and downsides when it comes to visibility, and it's hard to point one out and say that it is the definitive winner. For example, 16x9 has the massive perk of being able to see more of the sides of your screen, meaning that you'll be able to spot people that you otherwise wouldn't. And although there are people that would argue that if players are that far away from your crosshairs, you probably wouldn't have been able to kill them anyway, that's not always true. Even in pro play, there have been plenty of examples of messy situations where pros didn't spot somebody solely because of 4x3. And as you can probably imagine, if it happens to the pros, it definitely happens to normal players too. But that doesn't mean that you should immediately switch to 16x9 right away. I mean, there's a reason we're making this video to begin with. The biggest advantage that 4x3 offers when compared to 16x9 is the fact that it's a lot more zoomed in, allowing you to focus more on the middle of your screen, aka what's important, and also making it easier to spot opponents, especially at those longer ranges. Some people also argue that it's easier to aim with this, but in order to believe that logic, you kind of have to believe that sitting closer to your monitor also makes it easier to aim because you're effectively achieving the same thing. For that, again, the same thing counts though. Some people do, some people don't. I'm not here to judge, so feel free to believe what you like. Either way though, just the ability to spot people that you otherwise wouldn't is a big deal, similar to the advantages to the sides of 16x9. Basically, it comes down to what you think will impact you more when it comes to visibility. Opponents on the side of your screen, or opponents holding pixel angles that are otherwise hard to spot normally. I personally think that purely on visibility, 16x9 has a slightly better case, but you can make that argument that it only helps situationally, and 4x3 stretched helps in every fight, which means it's pretty much up in the air again. So with visibility out of the way, that brings us to today's question of the day. Today's question is, what aspect ratio are you currently using? Are you playing on native and are running 16x9, or are you more of a 4x3 kind of gamer? Hell, maybe you're even using the more extreme 5x4 or the ultimate middle ground of 16x10. No matter what res you're using though, make sure to let us know in the comments down below. Now let's get back to the video. Something else that's really important to consider in this debate though is performance. Not yours, but the game's. After all, they do correlate. Quite some time ago, 3K Licks Phillip made a great video on this topic. FPS makes a difference for your ability to perform, and not just in the way that you think it does. A lot of people believe that the only thing that's important when it comes to FPS is that your FPS is above your refresh rate. So if, for example, you have a 144Hz monitor, the only thing that's important is that you have FPS that's also above that figure. But they don't think that the difference between, let's say, 200 or 400 FPS is a big factor. But in reality, it is. More frames per second means that your monitor has more frames to choose from, and thus that you have a more accurate frame at any point in time. The reason for that is because your PC just tries to push out as many frames as possible, and with current technology, it's not possible to space them out perfectly. That basically means that in theory, 100 of those 144 frames could happen in the first half of a second, leaving only 44 in the remainder. Of course, that is a pretty extreme example for when your refresh rate is exactly equal to your frame rate, but you can probably see how having higher FPS would counteract that. On top of the fact that the game is snappier though, you also have to consider that it feels snappier. Lag and delay are both things experienced players can and will feel, and if the game just straight up feels better, you will also be playing better. The reason we mention this is because, as many of you guys know, 4x3 generally has fewer pixels to render than 16x9, at least if you're not playing on 16x9's lowest resolution, which isn't exactly recommended anyway. Fewer pixels means less graphical performance needed to render frames, and therefore higher FPS. So basically 4x3 will just give you higher FPS, which in return will make your games more snappy, which is relevant even if you have a low refresh rate monitor. That being said, we don't want to promote the idea that the only reason you're stuck in Silver or Gold Nova is because of your 60Hz monitor or your low FPS. If you have the skills required, you will be able to get to Global, or even face at level 10, regardless of if you're on 30 FPS or not. I'm not saying that it's easy, but your frames are definitely not to blame. If you're feeling stuck in your rank and you think your PC is why, try booking a session with one of our many top-ranked coaches, and you'll quickly find what you actually need to be focusing on to improve. You can even take a look at the Simple Master course where he teaches you how to play like him and the way that he approaches his rounds. It's a really informative watch, and I just cannot recommend it enough. But one of the most important parts of this debate is what do the pros think? We all love copying pro settings, crosshairs, and gear, and the fact that most pros use 4x3 is definitely a big talking point for many people. According to ProSettings.net, 74% of all pros use 4x3, and 73% of those people use stretched as opposed to black bars, which is basically having 2 black bars on the sides of your screen. People who support black bars say it helps them focus on the middle of the screen, but honestly, I wouldn't really recommend using it. By far the biggest takeaway from this though is that only 12% of pros are on 16:9, which, yeah, isn't a lot. And there's also the 10% of people that run 16:10, and finally the absolute mad lad 4% that use 5x4. 16:9 is really unpopular in the pro scene, and it's hard to say why that is necessarily. The most commonly used reason to explain it is because pros are used to their settings, and the younger players just copy theirs. But honestly, that weak explanation itself is a bit lacking. Many of the top pros have openly said that they've tried 16:9, but that it just wouldn't stick. Maybe there's some good news for it though, as recently both Device and ZywOo, aka the number 3 and 1 players for 2020, gave it a chance. Device said that he did it due to eye strain, and ZywOo just wanted to give it a shot. ZywOo's experiment was short-lived though, because in the first 2 tournaments that he tried it out, he had some of the worst performances in his entire career, including his lowest ever rated game. The guy went 2-17 against Complexity on Overpass, and needless to say, his rating of 0.28 wasn't too pretty. For the best player in the world, this isn't going to be a game he's proud of, and maybe his new aspect ratio is partly to blame. It's hard to say if he would have had that much better of a performance if he was on 4x3, because it's hard to really believe that it makes that big of a deal. But either way, it just comes down to what the pro's comfortable with. Now he's back to 4x3 and he's putting up numbers that we've come to expect once again. Honestly though, you shouldn't expect the pros to always find out what's best. After all, it took them a few years to even realize that the AUG and Krieg were busted, even though the then COD noobs realized that from the very beginning. Even in the pro scene, there's a lot of herd behavior going on, and it's difficult to say what res is best just by looking at what they're using. But I think that the most important thing to think about with this debate is how each aspect ratio makes you feel. I'm talking about a placebo effect. There's plenty of scientific evidence of how real placebo effects are, and if you believe that a certain setting, resolution, crosshair, or I don't even know, view model is gonna make you play better, you're gonna end up playing better. Similar to how perhaps you might play really well after you've just bought a new skin. If you truly believe that on 4x3 stretched aiming is that much easier, then for you it will be. Personally, if I play 4x3 stretched, I feel like I have a much better focus on the horizontal axis, which in return is very important for pre-aiming and crosshair placement. And since I have better focus on it, I also end up actually having better crosshair placement in the real game. Another thing the 4x3 does for me is give me a lot more confidence, since I feel like my peaks are a lot better and quicker. That combined with better crosshair placements then ends up winning me a lot more duels. Finally, I also feel like my aim just instantly becomes better. The targets appear bigger, so they must be easier to hit as well. Even though I know that all those things don't make any sense, why would I not be able to focus on my crosshair placements on 16:9? I'm aware that I'm not actually moving faster, it just appears to be that way. And I also know that aiming should not actually be easier. Targets appear to move faster as well after all. For the record, I don't think that sitting closer to your monitor makes it easier either. But in the heat of the moment, when I'm playing the game, the feeling of these things makes me believe them. For 16:9 though, I do have similar thoughts. I often think that holding angles is actually easier, although not all the time. I thoroughly believe that I turned into a smarter player and kind of feels like it turned into a mini Rops, where my angle clearing becomes perfect and my movement gets upgraded. Although I almost automatically start playing a lot more passive as well. So to conclude, honestly, the 4x3 stretch versus 16:9 debate doesn't really matter. It's not a question about what's best and more about what feels right for you. Because of that, the best res is not necessarily the one that all the pros are on, but rather the one that you do your best work on. Anyone that claims that one is definitively better than the other doesn't really know what they're talking about and shouldn't be taken all too seriously. At the end of the day, you should just find out what you like to use and then go with that. If you're already very used to 16:9 and were just wondering if you needed to switch by 4x3 in order to keep up, then I hope this helped you figure out you don't. And if you're looking to experiment and switch between the two, then yeah, feel free to do so. Switching is probably going to take some getting used to though, but there's no harm to it. And remember that no matter what aspect ratio you end up picking, it won't really matter much anyway. Unless, of course, you think it does.
Well, what do you all think? Are we completely off? Already halfway through blasting us in the comment section? Awesome. Comments are good for the YouTube algorithm anyway. And hey, I don't think that we were actually going to change any hardcore opinions with this video to begin with, but just remember that if you're starting off in the game, that your goal should be to play what's comfortable to you. Also, if you enjoyed the video or learned anything new today, then remember to leave a like and sub to the channel because we got so much more content coming out in the future. That's it for today, so best of luck in your grinding, and I'll see you next time.